This video is by Straight Goods News, SGNews.ca.
I'm pleased to present my Fall 2012 report, which was tabled in Parliament this morning. Our report examines several environmental programs and activities intended to support sustainable natural resource development. Given the central role of natural resources in the Canadian economy, it's critical that environmental protection keeps pace with economic development. I am concerned by the gaps we found in the way federal programs related to natural resources are managed. Areas of progress in establishing marine protected areas right across Canada. However, the level of protection falls well short of what the Ocean Act calls for. Given that conservation actions are not keeping pace with the increasing pressures on our oceans, the government needs to complete the network of marine protected areas to safeguard Canada's marine species and ecosystems. Canada, Newfoundland and Labrador boards have adequately managed the day-to-day environmental impacts of offshore oil and gas activities. They and their federal partners need to do more to prepare for a major oil spill. We identified several deficiencies that limit the offshore's ability to take over the response should operators fail to respond appropriately to a major spill. For example, the boards and federal entities had not tested their collective plans or joint capacity. Our report also examines environmental financial guarantees and absolute liability limits related to 4 sectors for which the federal government is responsible: mining in Canada's north, spills from oil tankers, offshore oil and gas platforms, and nuclear power limits in the nuclear and offshore oil and gas sectors. We found adequate systems regarding the federal government's holding of approximately $11 billion in financial guarantees to cover site remediation costs after operations cease. By contrast, we found several shortcomings in the oversight of the $500 million the federal government holds in financial guarantees for the mining sector in Canada's north. These shortcomings include insufficient guarantees as well as significant gaps in mining inspections required by regulation. Has decreased since 2000, and a significant portion of support is now corrected to cleaner technologies. At the same time, the study identified a number of tax incentives that remain in place and provide a significant amount of support to the fossil fuel sector. Finally, I'm pleased to present the annual report on environmental petitions. This year, we received 23 petitions requesting information from government ministers on a range of environmental concerns about the toxicity of substances used for hydraulic fracturing of shale gas and the lack of public disclosure of those substances. There are approximately 200,000 hydraulic fracturing wells in Canada, and that number is expected to double over the next 20 years. With the oil and gas sector exempted from reporting pollutant releases, the government cannot know if Canadians are adequately protected.
Resource development industry on all parts, all coasts, and yet it doesn't seem that our ability to protect taxpayers from the fallout from that is galloping along with it. Could you tell me what concerns you about that?
Well, clearly what we said is there's a boom in natural resources in this country. The government has identified up to $600 billion in new natural resources projects. We know that shale gas is expected to double. Tanker traffic on the West Coast will increase 300% in the next couple of years. And so, the real question is, if environmental regulations and environmental protection does not keep pace with that level of economic activity, then it puts Canadians at risk in terms of exposure to pollutants, to contaminants, but it also exposes them, as you've said, to real economic costs. And last spring we informed Parliament that the environmental liabilities the government holds then was over $7.7 billion in contaminated sites alone. That's actually now gone up since we tabled that by $600 million. It's now $8.3 billion. So there's both an environmental cost, a human health cost, but there's a real economic cost of actually not paying attention to what these projects are doing.
And just as a follow-up, you say in your report that our actual liabilities, like the insurance essentially, that we require companies to put up before they start the projects is really low compared to the rest of the world. What could taxpayers actually be on the hook for if we had a big spill?
Well, that would depend on the spill. And, it's important to say these spills are rare, but we, look at Deepwater Horizon. So we know now the costs and civil damages in the Gulf of Mexico is rising up to now $40 billion or more. The absolute liability limit on the East Coast in Atlantic Canada is $30 million. The liability limit in the nuclear sector in Canada is $75 million. That's going back now over 30 years that's been reviewed. The absolute liability limit for nuclear in the United States is $12 billion. So the order of magnitude of these gaps is really, substantial.
We have had, I think, what many people would call a boom in changes to environmental legislation in the form of the omnibus legislation, the last two bills. On balance, has it enhanced the changes in those bills enhanced protection for the environment?
What I would say is, one thing I'm concerned about is, an unbalance between accelerating natural resource development and environmental programs which are either not keeping pace because of the gaps we found not only here, in previous reports we've said that there's gaps in inspections of pipelines, of oil and gas pipelines by the National Energy Board. We've said that there's problems or weaknesses with federal government ability to respond to a spill from a tanker. The problems with the ability of the federal government to understand the impacts of the oil sands development in Western Canada. So if you put all these together, it's not just from this report, you end up with a portrait where there's some serious questions about the federal capacity to safeguard Canada's environment.
Raymond Fillon, TVA.
Bonjour, M. Vaughn. Au sujet des lacunes dont vous parlez dans les plans d'urgence en Atlantique.
Required to have no net loss now, that there could actually be harm or lack of protection in those cases where they've put up the guarantees.
There's two areas where we said that the consequences of the changes that the federal government has introduced last year has created uncertainty, and one of them is the changes to the fisheries, the fish habitat policy. Under the old regime, companies had to put down a guarantee to pay for expected changes in fish habitat. So we went and we said to the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, that with the changes, what now is supposed to happen? There's over $100 million that's been held since 2008. What's supposed to happen going forward? And they said, we don't know. We don't know what the consequence of that policy change is. So it's a big question. It's a question in terms of level of protection, and it's also a big question in terms of your company going in. Do I have to pay? Do I not have to pay? Which fish habitat are protected? Which ones are not? That one is unclear. And the second one is the changes to the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act. Similarly, the two offices have said they were caught by surprise with the changes announced last year. They've decided it's more prudent for them to stick with the old regime because under the old regime there was a requirement to evaluate exploratory drilling, for example, and exploratory drilling was what Deepwater Horizon is about. So there is no requirement under the new CA law to examine a whole bunch of phases, which the offices have said we better do this for our own safety.
It kind of suggested there's some improvisation in terms of the way the government has introduced this legislation.
What I would say is it's surprising, given the magnitude of the changes for both pieces of legislation, that all those steps would at least have been foreseen. So I would say that there's uncertainty leveling on some confusion about how to make those extremely important policy changes into action. To be fair, we're coming up now on I think 6 months, 7 months. So this is still I think a work in progress. But in this period of transition, I think it's safe to say there's
given that it could happen at any time, how confident you are that we'll ever get to that point where we're ready? What will it take? And then on the financial assurances side, how do you address that gap for taxpayers? Do you go back to the companies and say, you should give us more money? I'm just wondering if you can look at some of the solutions that would address some of your concerns overall.
Well, so first on the how to fix the the gaps we found in readiness for a big oil spill if one happened in an offshore platform. We've actually said in the chapter, I mean, here's what a good emergency plan looks like. And, the first thing is, know what you're supposed to do. I mean, it's not in the middle of an accident. You're trying to figure out who has the jurisdiction and who has the role and the mandate. And we found confusion there. Put these tests, these plans and test them. So make sure they're not a piece of paper that sits on a shelf, but do some exercises, have some detection capacity, have the right equipment, have the right expertise, and those characteristics are outlined in the chapter, and also learn from elsewhere. So when we were planning this, we went down to the United States. We met with the senior officials in the U.S. Say what was the lessons you've gained now from Deepwater Horizon, and they've now centralized their response capacities, so they don't have a division between their Coast Guard and other bureaus. They're trying to unify. So I think there's a lot of lessons. And in terms of your second, the absolute liability limits, well, I mean, I think the simple answer is go and review them and then put them in line with what you think the risks are. So I know the Minister Kent announced last week they were going to review and update the absolute liability limits for offshore platforms, and I think that's absolutely welcome. There'd be a similar question in nuclear installations, but I think the absolute liability limits is something that I think actually could be addressed quite quickly. We know that there's a boom in natural resources in this country, and I think what we need now, given the gaps, given the problems we found, is a boom in environmental protection in this country as well, because these need to move hand in hand. You can't have environmental protection trying to catch up with legacy issues that have been left because of a boom in natural resources. So I think this is the cautionary tale from this report, that right now there is an unbalance and a risk of an unbalance between environmental protection and an acceleration in natural resource development.
And we don't seem to be having a boom in environmental regulation. And let me ask you, you talk about the confusion over roles and the uncertain impact of some of the changes in the omnibus bill. Do you think that's simply the result of trying to make so many changes at once, or do you think it's a willful, deliberate attempt to relax environmental regulations so that resource development is easier?
No, I don't by any means think that there's... what I would say is if any system goes through significant changes all at once, then you're going to have things falling out. And, that's in the private sector, companies, if they're going through change management, they'll make sure that everything is in a row before they introduce those changes. With the changes that took place last year, these were game-changing transformations in some keystone environmental regulations intended to protect environmental quality in this country. And if you make those changes all at once, you shouldn't be surprised if actually things then aren't working the way they're supposed to. So what we found at the end was, in this period of transition, quite a bit of uncertainty and confusion.
Julie Van Duzen, CBC.
Yes, Mr. Vaughn, you point out in your report, I guess it seems pretty obvious, this potential possibility of an oil spill and the tanker traffic going up by 300%. We've seen the Gulf of Mexico. I guess I just want your perspective on, in terms of these liability limits, what has been the holdup as you see it?
Well, the liability limits on the tanker traffic actually are in line with the international standards. So if there's a tanker spill, it's $1.3 billion, and that's pretty much the same. Canada's actually been a leader on the international side. The liability limits for other areas like nuclear and offshore petroleum platform, I mean, you'd have to ask the government what the holdup is. But it seems to me 35 years since the last time you've actually looked at a liability limit is really pretty shocking, and then for 30 years and then 20 years for offshore platforms, and we know that risk involved, the risk dimensions of these change. So one would have thought that something as important to the Canadian economy, you go back and look at these every 5 years or 6 years, but 35 years is it speaks for itself.